My name is Emma Thompson. I'm 20 years old, and I just discovered that my parents stole my entire $180,000 college fund to pay for a 3-month European vacation with my sister's family, then had the audacity to tell me I should just drop out of Boston University and get a job because college is overrated anyway. What they didn't know was that their greed and favoritism was about to cost them a $2 million inheritance from the one person in our family who truly understood the value of education and hard work. I've always been the academic achiever in my family, maintaining a 4.0 GPA throughout high school and earning a full scholarship to cover half my tuition at Boston University, where I'm studying biomedical engineering. My dream has always been to work in medical research, developing technologies that could help people with disabilities or chronic illnesses. It's not just a career goal, it's a calling that drives everything I do. My college fund was established by my maternal grandparents when I was born, with the specific intention of ensuring that I could pursue higher education without financial stress. My grandmother, Margaret Thompson, was a successful businesswoman who had built a thriving real estate empire from nothing, and she believed passionately in the power of education to transform lives. She had always told me that education was the one investment that no one could ever take away from you. The fund started at $50,000 and had grown to $180,000 through careful investment over 20 years. It was supposed to cover my tuition, room and board, books, and living expenses for all 4 years of college, with enough left over for graduate school if I chose to pursue advanced degrees. The account was managed by my parents as trustees, but the money was specifically designated for my educational expenses. Growing up, the favoritism in our family was so obvious that even neighbors commented on it. My older sister Michelle, who is now 28, was always the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was expected to be self-sufficient and responsible. Michelle had never shown any interest in higher education, instead choosing to get married at 19 and have children immediately. But rather than being disappointed by her lack of ambition, my parents treated her choices as admirable and continued to support her financially even after marriage. Michelle and her husband Tyler have never been financially independent. They live in a house that my parents helped them buy, drive cars that my parents helped them finance, and rely on constant financial assistance for their daily expenses. When their children need clothes, school supplies, or activities, my parents pay for everything. When Michelle wants to redecorate her house or take a vacation, my parents fund those expenses too. Meanwhile, I've been working part-time jobs since I was 16 to pay for my own clothes, car expenses, and personal needs. When I wanted to attend summer academic programs or science camps, I was told to find scholarships or pay my own way. When I needed a laptop for college, I saved up money from my job at a local tutoring center. The message was always clear. Michelle deserved support, while I was expected to earn everything myself. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Like your achievements and dreams matter less than everyone else's comfort? That's exactly how I felt throughout high school and my first year of college, watching my parents pour money into Michelle's lifestyle while treating my academic success as something I should accomplish entirely on my own. Last month, I received my tuition bill for the spring semester, and when I called my parents to arrange the payment from my college fund, they seemed evasive and uncomfortable. "We'll talk about it when you come home for Thanksgiving," my father said. "There are some things we need to discuss about your college expenses." The tone of his voice made me nervous, but I assumed they wanted to talk about budgeting, or maybe switching to a less expensive meal plan. When I arrived home for Thanksgiving break, I immediately noticed that something was different about my parents' behavior. They seemed guilty and defensive, avoiding eye contact and changing the subject whenever I mentioned school or my upcoming semester. Michelle and her family were also there for the holiday, and I couldn't help but notice that she was wearing expensive new jewelry and designer clothes that clearly cost more than my parents could typically afford. During dinner, Michelle started talking excitedly about an amazing trip they had just returned from. 3 months touring Europe with her husband and 2 children. She showed us hundreds of photos on her phone, describing luxury hotels in Paris, private tours of museums in Rome, and first-class flights between countries. The vacation clearly cost tens of thousands of dollars, and I couldn't understand how Michelle and Tyler could afford such an extravagant trip on their modest incomes. "How did you guys manage to pay for such an expensive vacation?" I asked innocently, genuinely curious about how they had funded what appeared to be a once-in-a-lifetime trip. The question caused an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere, with my parents exchanging nervous glances and Michelle suddenly becoming defensive. "We've been saving up for years," Michelle said quickly, but her voice sounded forced and unconvincing. "Tyler got a bonus at work, and we decided to use it for a family adventure before the kids get too old to enjoy traveling with us. But I knew Tyler's job as a warehouse supervisor, and there was no way his bonus could cover the kind of luxury travel they were describing. That evening, I decided to check on my college fund balance online. I had been monitoring the account periodically throughout college to ensure that tuition payments were being processed correctly, and I wanted to make sure there would be enough money for the spring semester and my remaining 2 years of study. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The account balance was $847, not $84,700 or $8,470, just $847. Over $179,000 had been withdrawn in a series of transactions over the past 4 months, leaving barely enough money to cover my textbooks for 1 semester. I stared at the screen in disbelief, refreshing the page multiple times to make sure I wasn't seeing an error. The transaction history showed systematic withdrawals that corresponded exactly with Michelle's European vacation timeline. Large amounts had been transferred out to pay for flights, hotels, car rentals, restaurants, and shopping expenses. My college fund, the money my grandmother had specifically saved for my education, had been completely depleted to pay for my sister's luxury vacation. I printed out the account statements and walked downstairs to confront my parents, my hands shaking with anger and disbelief. They were sitting in the living room watching television, looking relaxed and content, completely unaware that their financial theft was about to be exposed. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk about my college fund. Right now." I spread the printed statements on the coffee table in front of them, showing the devastating account balance and the withdrawal history that told the story of their betrayal. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents looked at the papers with expressions that mixed guilt with defiance, clearly caught in a lie, but not yet ready to take responsibility for what they had done. My mother was the first to speak, her voice defensive and dismissive. "Emma, you're being dramatic," she said. "The money is just temporarily redirected. We'll figure out a way to pay for your school." But her explanation was so vague and unconvincing that it was clear she had no actual plan for replacing the stolen funds. My father's response was even worse. "Honestly, Emma, we think you should consider whether college is really worth all this stress and expense. Michelle is perfectly happy without a degree, and she has a beautiful family and a good life. Maybe you should just get a job and start earning money instead of spending it on classes that might not even help you in the real world." The suggestion that I should abandon my dreams of becoming a biomedical engineer because they had stolen my education fund was so shocking that I couldn't initially respond. They were asking me to give up everything I had worked for because they had chosen to fund my sister's vacation instead of my future. "You stole my college fund," I said, my voice rising with anger and disbelief. "Grandma and Grandpa saved that money specifically for my education, and you spent it on Michelle's vacation. How am I supposed to pay for next semester? How am I supposed to finish my degree?" The response I received will be burned into my memory forever. My mother looked at me with cold indifference and said, "Just drop out and get a job, Emma. College is overrated anyway, and you're smart enough to succeed without a degree. Michelle turned out fine without going to college, and you can too." That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I made the phone call that would change everything. I sat on my bed staring at my phone for almost an hour before I found the courage to call my grandmother. It was late, but I knew Grandma Margaret was a night owl who often stayed up reading business journals and financial reports. She had always been my biggest supporter, the one person in my family who truly understood my academic ambitions and believed in my potential to make a difference in the world. Margaret Thompson was 78 years old, but she had the energy and sharp mind of someone decades younger. She had built a real estate empire from scratch, starting with a single rental property in the 1970s and eventually owning commercial buildings throughout New England. She was worth over $4 million, but more importantly, She was a woman who had overcome gender discrimination and financial challenges to achieve success through intelligence, hard work, and determination. Growing up, I had spent countless afternoons at Grandma's house, listening to her stories about building her business and overcoming obstacles that would have defeated most people. She had always encouraged my interest in science and engineering, often saying that women needed to excel in STEM fields to prove that intelligence had no gender. She was the one who had insisted on establishing the college fund, despite my parents' protests that it was too much money for a child's education. "Grandma," I said when she answered the phone, "I need to tell you something, and you're going to be very upset." My voice was shaking as I prepared to reveal what my parents had done, knowing that this conversation was going to change our family dynamics forever. "Emma, sweetheart, what's wrong?" she asked, and I could hear the immediate concern in her voice. "Are you hurt? Are you in trouble at school?" The care and attention in her voice was such a contrast to my parents' dismissive attitude that I almost started crying right there. I took a deep breath and told her everything, about discovering the depleted college fund, about Michelle's expensive European vacation, about my parents' suggestion that I should drop out of college and get a job. I read her the account statements over the phone, detailing every withdrawal and explaining how the money had been spent on luxury travel instead of my education. The silence on the other end of the phone was more frightening than any angry response would have been. When Grandma Margaret finally spoke, her voice was cold and controlled in a way I had never heard before. "Emma," she said, "I want you to understand that what your parents did isn't just wrong. It's theft. They stole money that was specifically designated for your education, and they used it to fund a vacation for your sister. Have you ever had someone validate your feelings when you thought you might be overreacting? That's exactly what happened when my grandmother confirmed that my parents' actions were not just disappointing, but actually criminal. She helped me understand that I wasn't being dramatic or unreasonable. I was being victimized by people who were supposed to protect my interests. Tell me exactly what they said when you confronted them," she continued, and I could hear her taking notes as I repeated my parents' dismissive responses and their suggestion that I should abandon my education. With each detail I shared, I could sense her anger building, though she kept her voice calm and controlled. "Grandma," I said, "I don't know what to do. I have 1 semester left on my partial scholarship, but without the college fund, I can't afford to continue. I've worked so hard to get where I am, and I'm so close to achieving my dreams, but I can't afford $25,000 per semester without that money." What she said next changed the trajectory of my entire life. "Emma, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not going to drop out of college. You are not going to abandon your dreams because your parents chose to steal from you. I am going to make sure that you have everything you need to complete your education and pursue graduate school if you choose to." The relief I felt at hearing those words was overwhelming, but it was mixed with sadness about the family conflict that was about to unfold. I knew that my grandmother's intervention was going to create a permanent rift between her and my parents, and I felt guilty about being the cause of that family division. "I don't want to create problems between you and my parents," I said, but she cut me off immediately. "Emma, your parents created this problem when they stole your education fund. I'm not going to let them destroy your future because they chose to prioritize your sister's vacation over your education. This is about right and wrong, and what they did was absolutely wrong." My grandmother then explained something that I had never fully understood about our family financial dynamics. The college fund that my parents had stolen wasn't just money that she and my grandfather had saved. It was part of a larger estate plan that included significant inheritance provisions for my parents. She had always intended to leave the majority of her wealth to her son Robert, with smaller portions going to me and Michelle. "Your parents are set to inherit approximately $3.2 million when I die," she said, her voice becoming even more controlled and precise. "They knew about this inheritance, and they chose to steal from your college fund anyway. They gambled that I would never find out about their theft, or that I wouldn't care enough about your education to take action. The revelation that my parents were expecting to inherit millions of dollars made their theft of my college fund even more outrageous. They weren't desperate people making difficult choices. They were greedy people who had chosen immediate gratification over their daughter's future. knowing that they would eventually inherit enough money to easily replace what they had stolen. What they didn't consider, my grandmother continued, is that I value character and integrity above family relationships. I've spent my entire life building wealth through honest work and smart investments, and I'm not going to leave that wealth to people who steal from their own children. I could hear papers rustling in the background as my grandmother began making notes and plans. Emma, I'm going to call my lawyer first thing in the morning. I'm changing my will to remove your parents as beneficiaries, and I'm leaving the majority of my estate to you instead. People who steal from their children's education funds don't deserve to inherit wealth that they'll probably squander on more vacations and luxury purchases. The magnitude of what she was saying took several minutes to fully process. My grandmother wasn't just going to help me finish college. She was going to fundamentally restructure her estate plan to ensure that my parents face serious consequences for their theft and favoritism. But Grandma, I said, that's millions of dollars. Are you sure you want to make such a drastic change? Maybe there's another way to handle this situation. I was overwhelmed by her generosity, but I was also concerned about the family chaos that would result from such a dramatic restructuring of her inheritance plans. Emma, she said firmly, I've been watching your parents favor Michelle over you for your entire life. I've seen them give her everything while expecting you to earn your own way. I thought that at least they would respect the educational fund that was specifically designated for your future. But they've shown me that they care more about Michelle's comfort than your dreams. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was filled with pride and determination. You are going to be a biomedical engineer, Emma. You're going to develop technologies that help people and make the world a better place. I'm not going to let anyone, including your own parents, prevent you from achieving that goal. The conversation continued for another hour as my grandmother outlined her plans for ensuring my educational and financial security. She was going to pay my remaining college expenses immediately, establish a graduate school fund, and create a trust that would support my career development and research goals. But more importantly, she was going to send a clear message to my parents that theft and favoritism have consequences. By removing them from her will and leaving the majority of her estate to me, she was ensuring that their greed would cost them far more than they had stolen. I want you to promise me something, she said as our call was ending. Promise me that you won't tell your parents about the will changes until after I'm gone. I want them to continue believing that they're going to inherit my money, so they can't try to manipulate me or pressure me to change my mind. I promised to keep her secret, understanding that the knowledge of their lost inheritance would be revealed at exactly the right time to maximize the impact of her message about character and consequences. As I hung up the phone that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope for my future, and confidence that justice would eventually be served. My grandmother had not only solved my immediate financial crisis, but had also shown me what it looked like when someone truly valued education and integrity over family politics and favoritism. The next morning, I would watch my parents continue to act as if their theft was acceptable, completely unaware that their greed had just cost them millions of dollars and permanently changed the trajectory of our family's future. The next morning at breakfast, I watched my parents with new eyes, knowing what my grandmother had planned, but unable to reveal the consequences that were heading their way. They were acting completely normal, as if stealing my college fund was just a minor family disagreement that would blow over with time. My mother was making pancakes and talking about Christmas plans, while my father was reading the newspaper and discussing his business meetings for the week. Emma, my mother said with forced cheerfulness, I hope you're not still upset about yesterday's conversation. We really do think you should consider your options carefully. College is so expensive, and there are lots of successful people who never finished their degrees. She was trying to normalize their theft by continuing to suggest that my education wasn't worth the investment. Michelle was also there with her family, and she seemed completely oblivious to the fact that her European vacation had been funded by stealing my future. She was showing my parents more photos from the trip and talking about planning another family vacation to Australia next year. The casual way she discussed spending money while I was facing the prospect of dropping out of college was infuriating. Maybe Emma could come with us to Australia, Michelle said, apparently thinking she was being generous. She could take a gap year from school and work to save up money for the trip. It would be good for her to see the world before she gets too caught up in her studies. The suggestion that I should abandon my education to join her on another expensive vacation was so tone-deaf that I almost laughed. Have you ever been surrounded by people who were acting like nothing had changed while you knew that their entire world was about to be turned upside down? That's exactly how I felt sitting at that breakfast table, watching my family make plans based on expectations that were about to be completely destroyed. My phone buzzed with a text message from my grandmother. Just met with my lawyer. Everything is arranged. Your spring semester tuition will be paid this afternoon. Don't let them pressure you into making any decisions about school. The relief I felt reading that message was incredible, but I had to hide my emotions from my family. I need to get back to Boston this afternoon, I announced, standing up from the breakfast table. I have some things to take care of before the semester starts. My parents exchanged glances, clearly hoping that I would use the time to reconsider their suggestion that I drop out of college. Emma, my father said, I hope you'll think seriously about what we discussed. You're a smart girl, and you could probably get a good job right away instead of spending more money on classes. Michelle could probably help you find something in her field. Borsam. The fact that he was still pushing for me to abandon my biomedical engineering degree to work in whatever field Michelle was involved in showed how little he understood about my goals and capabilities. The drive back to Boston gave me time to process everything that had happened and to think about how dramatically my life was about to change. I was no longer the daughter who was expected to earn everything herself, while watching family money flow toward my sister's lifestyle. I was now the granddaughter who had earned the respect and support of the most successful person in our family. When I arrived at my dorm, I found an email from the University Financial Aid Office confirming that my spring semester tuition had been paid in full, along with room and board for the rest of my undergraduate years. There was also a note that a separate account had been established to cover books, supplies, and living expenses, ensuring that I would never again have to worry about the financial aspects of my education. But the most meaningful message was a handwritten note that had been delivered to my dorm room. It was from my grandmother, and it said, Emma, you are going to change the world through your work in biomedical engineering. I'm proud to invest in your future, and I know that every dollar spent on your education will come back to benefit humanity. Never let anyone make you feel guilty for pursuing excellence. Love, Grandma Margaret. That evening, I called my best friend Sarah to tell her what had happened. She had been worried about me since I had mentioned my parents' suggestion that I drop out of college, and she was shocked to learn about the theft and my grandmother's intervention. Emma, your parents are insane, she said. Who steals their kids' college fund to pay for a vacation? And who suggests that someone should drop out of biomedical engineering at Boston University to get a random job? They have no idea what they almost destroyed. Sarah's outrage on my behalf was validating, but it also helped me understand how abnormal my family's dynamics really were. Most parents would be proud to have a daughter studying biomedical engineering at a prestigious university, but mine were treating my academic success as an inconvenient expense that should be eliminated. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my studies with renewed energy and focus. Knowing that my grandmother believed in my potential and was willing to invest in my future gave me confidence that I had never felt before. I was no longer the family member who was expected to succeed without support. I was someone whose dreams were valued and protected. My grades that semester were the best of my college career. I was selected for a prestigious research program working on developing prosthetic devices with neural interfaces, exactly the kind of work I had always dreamed of doing. My professors were impressed with my dedication and innovation, and I started to see a clear path toward graduate school and a career in medical research. But the most satisfying part of that semester was watching my parents continue to make plans based on their expectation of inheriting my grandmother's wealth. They had started talking about early retirement, upgrading their house, and funding more elaborate vacations for Michelle's family. They had no idea that their theft of my college fund had cost them millions of dollars. During spring break, I visited my grandmother to thank her for everything she had done. She was thriving, actively managing her real estate portfolio and making plans for charitable donations that would benefit educational programs for young women in STEM fields. Emma, she said, as we sat in her study surrounded by business awards and family photos. "I want you to understand something important. The money I'm investing in your education isn't charity. It's an investment in someone who has the character and intelligence to use that education well. Your parents showed me that they don't understand the difference between spending money and investing in the future." She pulled out a thick folder of legal documents and spread them across her desk. "I've restructured my entire estate plan based on what happened with your college fund. The majority of my wealth will go to you, with provisions for educational scholarships and medical research funding. Michelle will receive a modest inheritance, but your parents will get nothing." The finality of her decision was both satisfying and sobering. My parents' greed had cost them not just their inheritance, but also their relationship with the most successful member of our family. They had chosen short-term gratification over long-term family harmony, and they were going to pay a price that far exceeded what they had stolen. "When will they find out?" I asked, curious about the timeline for this revelation. "They'll find out when I'm gone and the will is read," she said. "Until then, I want them to continue believing that their theft didn't have any real consequences. I want them to keep making plans based on money they're never going to receive." 6 months later, I received news that would bring my family's reckoning to a head. My grandmother had suffered a heart attack and was in the hospital. As I rushed to be with her, I knew that the moment of truth was approaching for my parents, and that their years of favoritism and theft were about to catch up with them in a way they never could have imagined. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. My grandmother had suffered a massive heart attack and was in intensive care at Massachusetts General Hospital. I threw on clothes and drove through the night from Boston, my mind racing with worry about losing the one person in my family who had truly understood and supported my dreams. When I arrived at the hospital, my parents and Michelle were already in the waiting room, looking distraught and exhausted. For the first time in months, we were united in our concern for Grandma Margaret, temporarily setting aside the tensions that had been building since the college fund incident. "The doctors say it's very serious," my mother said, her voice shaking. "She's stable for now, but they don't know if she's going to make it through the next few days." The possibility of losing my grandmother was devastating, but it was also mixed with anxiety about what her death would mean for our family dynamics. Over the next 3 days, we took turns sitting with Grandma Margaret, talking to her, and hoping she could hear us. When I was alone with her, I told her about my research project, my plans for graduate school, and how grateful I was for everything she had done for me. I also promised her that I would use my education to make the kind of difference in the world that she had always believed I could make. On the 4th day, Grandma Margaret regained consciousness briefly. She was weak and couldn't speak much, but she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Keep studying, Emma. Make me proud." Those were the last words she ever spoke to me, and they will be etched in my memory forever. My grandmother passed away peacefully the next morning, surrounded by family. Despite our complicated relationships, we all mourned the loss of a remarkable woman who had built an empire through intelligence and determination. But I also knew that her death would trigger revelations that would permanently change our family structure. The funeral was held the following week, attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by my grandmother's business success and charitable work. Real estate developers, community leaders, and scholarship recipients all came to pay their respects to a woman who had made a significant impact on her community. Have you ever attended a funeral knowing that it would be followed by revelations that would shock everyone present? That's exactly how I felt during the service. Watching my parents and Michelle grieve while having no idea that their expectations about inheriting my grandmother's wealth were about to be completely destroyed. After the funeral, my grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Davidson, asked the family to meet at his office the following day for the reading of the will. My parents seemed nervous but optimistic, clearly expecting to inherit the majority of my grandmother's $4.2 million estate. Michelle was already talking about how the inheritance would allow her family to buy a bigger house and take more elaborate vacations. "I think Grandma would have wanted us to use some of the money to travel and make memories as a family," Michelle said during the car ride to the lawyer's office. She always valued experiences over material things. The irony of her statement was incredible, considering that my parents had stolen my college fund to pay for her European vacation. When we arrived at Mr. Davidson's office, he looked serious and somewhat uncomfortable. He had been my grandmother's lawyer for over 20 years, and he clearly understood the family dynamics that had led to the dramatic will changes. "Before I read the will," he said, "I want everyone to understand that Margaret Thompson made several significant changes to her estate plan over the past year. These changes were made after careful consideration and multiple consultations, and they reflect her final wishes about how her wealth should be distributed." My parents exchanged confident glances, apparently assuming that any changes would be minor adjustments that wouldn't affect their substantial inheritance. They had been counting on my grandmother's money for months, making plans and commitments based on wealth they expected to receive. Mr. Davidson opened the will and began reading the formal legal language that established my grandmother's final wishes. The first few sections dealt with charitable donations and small bequests to longtime employees and friends. Then he reached the section that would change everything. "To my son Robert Thompson and his wife Carol Thompson, I leave the sum of $50,000 each to be distributed immediately upon my death." The amount was so shockingly small compared to what they had expected that my parents initially seemed confused rather than upset. "I'm sorry," my father said, "but I think there might be an error. My mother told me years ago that Carol and I were the primary beneficiaries of her estate. Shouldn't there be a larger bequest mentioned?" Mr. Davidson's expression remained neutral as he continued reading. "To my granddaughter Michelle Thompson Martinez, I leave the sum of $100,000 to be held in trust for the education of her children." The amount was generous, but still far less than what our family had expected. The tension in the room was becoming palpable as my parents realized that the major inheritance they had been counting on wasn't materializing. My mother was looking pale and confused, while my father was beginning to show signs of panic. "Mr. Davidson," my mother said, "there must be more. Margaret had over $4 million. Where's the rest of the estate going?" Her voice was rising with anxiety as she began to understand that her financial expectations were not going to be met. The lawyer looked directly at me before reading the next section. "To my granddaughter Emma Thompson, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all real estate holdings, investment accounts, and business assets, totaling approximately $4.1 million. This bequest is made in recognition of her dedication to her education, her strong character, and her commitment to using her talents to benefit others." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents and Michelle were staring at Mr. Davidson in shock, unable to process what they had just heard. I was inheriting virtually the entire estate, while they were receiving what amounted to token gifts. "That's impossible," my father said, his voice shaking. "There has to be a mistake. My mother wouldn't leave everything to Emma. She's just a college student." The disbelief in his voice was mixed with growing anger as he began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Mr. Davidson continued reading. "I have made this decision because my son Robert and his wife Carol demonstrated that they do not understand the value of education or the importance of keeping commitments to family members. Their decision to steal from Emma's college fund to pay for recreational travel showed me that they cannot be trusted with significant wealth. The revelation that my grandmother knew about the theft of my college fund hit my parents like a physical blow. They had assumed that their crime would remain secret, and they were now discovering that it had cost them millions of dollars. "She knew?" my mother whispered, her face turning white with shock. "How did she find out about the college fund?" The guilt and panic in her voice were unmistakable as she realized that their theft had been discovered and punished in the most devastating way possible. But Mr. Davidson wasn't finished reading my grandmother's explanation. "Robert and Carol chose to prioritize their elder daughter's vacation over their younger daughter's education, demonstrating favoritism that I found morally unacceptable. Emma has earned this inheritance through her character, her academic achievements, and her dedication to pursuing a career that will benefit society." The room erupted as my parents finally understood the full scope of what had happened. They hadn't just lost an inheritance. They had lost it specifically because of their theft from my college fund and their years of favoritism toward Michelle. "This is insane," my father shouted, jumping up from his chair. "Emma turned my mother against us. She manipulated an elderly woman into changing her will. The accusation was so unfair and desperate that even Michelle looked uncomfortable with his reaction. Mr. Davidson's voice remained calm and professional as he addressed my father's outburst. Mr. Thompson, your mother made these changes after discovering that you had stolen approximately $179,000 from Emma's education fund to pay for vacation expenses. She was not manipulated. She was responding to your actions and their impact on Emma's future. The legal finality of the situation was beginning to sink in, and I could see my parents calculating just how much their theft had cost them. They had stolen $179,000 and lost $4.1 million. Their greed had resulted in a net loss of nearly $4 million, one of the most expensive vacations in human history. The aftermath of the will reading was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. My parents sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the reality that their theft of my college fund had cost them a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. The $179,000 European vacation had ultimately cost them over $4 million, creating what was possibly the worst return on investment in family history. Michelle was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, Dad, you stole Emma's college money? You actually took the fund that Grandma set up for her education? Even my sister, who had been the beneficiary of my parents' favoritism her entire life, seemed shocked by the magnitude of what they had done. We didn't steal anything, my mother said defensively, but her voice lacked conviction. We borrowed the money temporarily. We were planning to pay it back when Robert's business picked up. The explanation was weak and unconvincing, especially since they had already suggested that I should drop out of college rather than finding a way to replace the stolen funds. My father was calculating numbers on a piece of paper, apparently trying to understand the full financial impact of their actions. $41 million, he kept muttering. We lost $41 million. The repetition suggested that he was having trouble processing the magnitude of their loss. Mr. Davidson cleared his throat and addressed the family with professional detachment. I need to remind everyone that the will is legally binding and was executed after careful consideration. Margaret Thompson was mentally competent when she made these changes, and she consulted with multiple advisors to ensure that her wishes were clearly documented. But my parents weren't ready to accept the finality of the situation. We're going to contest this will, my father announced, his voice gaining strength as he found something to focus his anger on. Emma manipulated a sick elderly woman into changing her inheritance. This isn't what my mother really wanted. The accusation stung, but I knew it was false and desperate. Dad, I said quietly, Grandma changed her will after you stole my college fund and told me to drop out of school. She made this decision because she was disgusted by your actions, not because I manipulated her. You turned my mother against me, he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. You poisoned her mind with lies about what happened with the college fund. The blame shifting was so typical of my parents' behavior that I almost felt sorry for them. Mr. Davidson intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. Mr. Thompson, I need to inform you that contesting this would be inadvisable. Your mother anticipated that possibility and included specific documentation about her reasons for the inheritance changes. She also recorded video statements explaining her decisions, which would be admissible in court. The revelation that my grandmother had created video evidence explaining her decision deflated my father's anger and replaced it with resignation. She had been thorough in protecting her final wishes and ensuring that my parents couldn't manipulate the legal system the way they had manipulated family dynamics. Have you ever watched someone realize that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined? That's exactly what was happening as my parents understood that their theft hadn't just affected my education. It had destroyed their financial future and permanently altered our family structure. Michelle, who had been quiet throughout most of the confrontation, suddenly broke down crying. This is all my fault, she sobbed. If I hadn't wanted to go to Europe, none of this would have happened. I destroyed our family because I wanted a vacation. The guilt in her voice was genuine, and for the first time, I saw her taking responsibility for her role in the crisis. Michelle, you didn't force us to take Emma's college money, my mother said. trying to comfort her older daughter. We made that decision ourselves. But even as she spoke, I could see the resentment building in my parents' eyes as they began to calculate how much Michelle's vacation had ultimately cost them. The meeting concluded with Mr. Davidson explaining the practical aspects of the inheritance transfer. I would gain control of my grandmother's real estate portfolio, investment accounts, and business assets within 30 days. The inheritance also included detailed instructions for continuing my grandmother's charitable work and establishing educational scholarships for young women in STEM fields. As we left the lawyer's office, my father made one final attempt to negotiate. "Emma, you don't need all that money. You could share some of it with your family. Your grandmother wouldn't have wanted you to be selfish with her wealth." The suggestion that I was being selfish with an inheritance that I had legitimately received was so hypocritical that I couldn't respond. "Dad," I said finally, "you chose Michelle's vacation over my education. Grandma chose my future over your comfort. Those were both conscious decisions with predictable consequences." The parallel between their choice and hers seemed to hit home, and he didn't respond. The ride home was conducted in complete silence, with each family member processing the new reality of our changed circumstances. My parents had lost millions of dollars. Michelle was dealing with guilt about her role in the crisis, and I was trying to understand what it meant to suddenly be wealthy, while my family was facing financial ruin. Over the next few weeks, the full impact of my grandmother's decision became clear. My parents' business was struggling, and they had been counting on the inheritance to fund their retirement and expand their operations. Without that expected windfall, they were facing the possibility of bankruptcy and the loss of their home. Michelle's husband, Tyler, was furious when he learned about the theft and its consequences. "You stole from your own daughter to pay for our vacation," he shouted at my parents during a family meeting. "Do you have any idea what you've done to our future? We were counting on that inheritance to buy a bigger house and secure our children's education." The family meeting that followed was the most honest conversation we had ever had about money, favoritism, and consequences. For the first time, Michelle acknowledged that she had been the beneficiary of unfair treatment throughout our childhood, and she apologized for accepting advantages that came at my expense. "Emma," she said, tears streaming down her face, "I'm sorry for all the years when I took things from you without realizing it. I'm sorry for the vacation that was paid for with your college money. I'm sorry for being the favorite when you were the one who actually deserved support and recognition." Her apology was meaningful, but it couldn't undo decades of favoritism or restore my parents' lost inheritance. The damage had been done, and our family would have to learn to function under completely different circumstances. My parents attempted to maintain their anger toward me for several months, blaming me for their financial troubles and suggesting that I should share my inheritance with them. But eventually, even they began to understand that their own actions had created the situation they were facing. "We made mistakes," my mother admitted during a phone call 6 months after the will reading. "We should have protected your college fund instead of using it for Michelle's vacation. We should have treated you fairly instead of always favoring your sister. We understand why your grandmother was disappointed in us." The admission was a step toward reconciliation, but it couldn't restore their lost inheritance or undo the years of damage that favoritism had caused to our family relationships. They would have to live with the consequences of their choices, just as I was learning to live with the benefits of my grandmother's support. Meanwhile, my academic career was flourishing in ways I had never imagined possible. With financial security assured by my inheritance, I was able to focus entirely on my studies and research without worrying about tuition, living expenses, or student loans. I was selected for advanced research programs, international conferences, and collaborative projects with leading medical institutions. But the most satisfying aspect of my new situation was being able to honor my grandmother's memory through my work. I established the Margaret Thompson Memorial Scholarship for Women in Biomedical Engineering, providing full tuition support for students who demonstrated both academic excellence and financial need. I also funded research grants for projects developing medical devices that could help disabled and elderly patients. 2 years after my grandmother's death, I graduated summa cum laude from Boston University with a degree in biomedical engineering. My parents and Michelle attended the graduation ceremony, and for the first time in my life, I felt like my achievements were being genuinely celebrated by my entire family, rather than just tolerated or ignored. "I'm proud of you, Emma," my father said after the ceremony, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "Your grandmother was right about your potential, and I'm sorry it took us so long to see it." The apology was sincere, and I could see that losing the inheritance had taught him valuable lessons about priorities and consequences. As I prepared to start graduate school at MIT with full funding from my inheritance, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. My parents' theft of my college fund had been devastating at the time, but it had ultimately led to my grandmother's intervention and the financial security that would allow me to pursue my dreams without compromise. The woman who had nearly been forced to drop out of college because her parents stole her education fund was now positioned to become a leading researcher in biomedical engineering, with the resources to make significant contributions to medical science and help other students achieve their educational goals. My grandmother's final gift hadn't just been money. It had been validation that education, character, and hard work are more valuable than family favoritism and short-term gratification. She had shown me that sometimes the people who truly love you are willing to make difficult decisions to protect your future, even when those decisions create conflict and controversy. 5 years after my grandmother's death, I was completing my PhD in biomedical engineering at MIT when I received news that would test how much our family had really learned from the inheritance crisis. My father's struggling marketing business was facing bankruptcy, and my parents were losing their house to foreclosure. They had exhausted their savings, trying to keep the company afloat, and they were facing the prospect of homelessness in their 60s. The phone call came from Michelle, who had been trying to help our parents navigate their financial crisis. "Emma," she said, her voice heavy with worry, "I don't know what else to do. Mom and Dad are going to lose everything. They're too proud to ask you for help, but I think they're hoping you might offer to assist them." The situation was complicated by the history of theft and favoritism that had defined our family relationships. My parents had stolen my college fund and lost millions of dollars because of their poor judgment, but they were also my family, and I didn't want to see them become homeless and destitute in their retirement years. "How much money do they need?" I asked, already knowing that I had the resources to solve their immediate financial problems. My grandmother's inheritance had grown significantly over the past 5 years through careful investment, and I could easily afford to help without affecting my own financial security. "They need about $200,000 to save the house and pay off their business debts," Michelle said. "I know it's a lot of money, and I know you have every right to refuse after what they did to you. But they're our parents, and I'm scared about what's going to happen to them. Have you ever been in a position where you could help someone who had previously hurt you, knowing that your assistance might enable them to avoid learning important lessons?" That's exactly the dilemma I faced as I considered whether to rescue my parents from the financial crisis that was largely of their own making. I spent several days thinking about the situation and consulting with the financial advisors who helped me manage my inheritance. The practical aspects were straightforward. I could easily afford to help my parents without affecting my own plans for education funding and medical research. But the emotional and psychological aspects were much more complex. On one hand, my parents had demonstrated poor judgment, favoritism, and outright theft in their financial decisions. Rescuing them from bankruptcy might teach them that they could continue making irresponsible choices without facing serious consequences. On the other hand, they were family members who had genuinely apologized for their mistakes and seemed to have learned from their errors. I decided to meet with my parents directly to discuss their situation and determine whether they had truly changed their attitudes and behaviors. The meeting took place at their house, which they were scheduled to lose within 60 days if they couldn't make their mortgage payments current. "Emma," my mother said as soon as I arrived, "we want you to know that we're not asking you for money. We know we don't deserve your help after what we did with your college fund. We just wanted to see you and tell you how proud we are of everything you've accomplished." The humility in her voice was genuine, and I could see that the financial crisis had forced my parents to confront their own limitations and mistakes. They were no longer the confident, entitled people who had dismissed my education as unimportant while funding my sister's luxuries. My father looked older and more fragile than I remembered, clearly worn down by months of financial stress and business failure. "Emma," I want you to understand that we know we brought this situation on ourselves. We made bad decisions with money, we treated you unfairly, and we lost your grandmother's inheritance because of our own greed and favoritism." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion we had ever had about money, family relationships, and personal responsibility. My parents acknowledged their history of favoritism, took full responsibility for stealing my college fund, and accepted that their current financial crisis was the result of their own poor judgment rather than bad luck or external circumstances. "We understand if you don't want to help us," my mother said. "We know we hurt you badly, and we know we lost the right to expect your support when we chose Michelle's vacation over your education. Whatever you decide, we want you to know that we're proud of the woman you've become and grateful that you succeeded despite our failures as parents." Their humility and genuine accountability impressed me, but I wanted to ensure that any assistance I provided would be structured to prevent future irresponsibility rather than enabling continued poor judgment. I proposed a comprehensive plan that would address their immediate needs while establishing safeguards against future financial crises. "I'm willing to help you save the house and pay off your business debts," I said, "but only under specific conditions that will ensure you don't find yourselves in this situation again." I outlined a plan that included financial counseling, monthly budget oversight, and restrictions on major expenditures without prior approval. The plan also included provisions that would benefit Michelle's family without creating new opportunities for favoritism or manipulation. I would establish education funds for her children, but the money would be managed by independent trustees to ensure it was used appropriately and couldn't be diverted for other purposes. My parents accepted every condition without hesitation, clearly understanding that my assistance was a gift they didn't deserve, rather than an obligation I owed them. They agreed to sell their struggling business, downsize their lifestyle, and submit to financial oversight to ensure they could maintain their independence without requiring additional bailouts. The most important aspect of the arrangement was that it established clear boundaries and expectations for our future relationship. I would be generous with financial support when it was genuinely needed, but I would not tolerate manipulation, favoritism, or irresponsible spending that put their security at risk. 6 months later, my parents had stabilized their finances and were living within their means for the first time in decades. They had sold their business, downsized to a smaller house, and developed budgeting skills that ensured their monthly expenses matched their retirement income. "Emma," my father said during one of our regular check-ins, "I want you to know that this experience has taught me more about money and responsibility than 40 years of running a business. We should have learned these lessons decades ago, but we're grateful that you are willing to help us learn them now." The transformation in my parents' behavior and attitudes was remarkable. They had stopped making grandiose plans based on unrealistic expectations. They were treating both their daughters equally, and they were managing their finances with the kind of caution and responsibility that should have characterized their behavior all along. Michelle had also undergone significant changes as a result of the family crisis. The guilt about her role in the college fund theft had motivated her to become more financially responsible and less dependent on family support. She had started her own interior design business and was earning enough money to support her family without requiring constant assistance from our parents. "I realize now that I was spoiled and entitled for most of my life," Michelle told me during a family dinner. "I thought I deserved financial support just because I was the favorite daughter, but I understand now that love shouldn't be conditional on who needs the most help or who makes the most demands." The family dynamic had fundamentally shifted from one based on favoritism and manipulation to one based on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries. My parents were no longer enabling irresponsible behavior. Michelle was no longer expecting automatic financial support, and I was no longer being taken for granted or treated as the family's invisible problem solver. As I prepared to defend my doctoral dissertation and begin my career as a biomedical research scientist, I reflected on how much our family had changed since the college fund crisis. My grandmother's intervention had not only secured my educational future, but had also forced all of us to confront destructive patterns that might have continued for decades. The inheritance that my parents had lost because of their theft and favoritism had ultimately benefited everyone by creating accountability and forcing genuine change in our family relationships. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to let them face the consequences of their actions, even when those consequences are severe and long-lasting. 7 years after my grandmother's death, I stood at the podium of the International Conference on Biomedical Engineering, presenting my groundbreaking research on neural interfaces for prosthetic limbs. The technology I had developed was helping paralyzed patients regain motor function and allowing amputees to control advanced prosthetics with unprecedented precision. It was exactly the kind of work my grandmother had envisioned when she chose to invest in my education, rather than enable my parents' irresponsibility. In the audience were my parents and Michelle, who had flown across the country to watch me receive the Young Innovator Award for my contributions to medical technology. The pride on their faces was genuine and well-deserved, representing a complete transformation from the family members who had once suggested I should drop out of college to get a job. After my presentation, my father approached me with tears in his eyes. "Emma," he said, "watching you up there, explaining how your research is helping disabled patients walk again, I finally understand what your grandmother saw in you. She knew you were going to change the world, and she was willing to sacrifice our inheritance to make sure you had that opportunity." The acknowledgement was meaningful because it showed that my father finally understood the difference between investing in potential and funding consumption. My grandmother hadn't been punishing him when she changed her will. She had been choosing to support someone who would use her wealth to benefit humanity rather than squander it on vacations and luxury purchases. "Dad," I replied, "Grandma didn't sacrifice your inheritance. You forfeited it when you chose Michelle's vacation over my education. She just recognized the difference between someone who would use money responsibly and someone who would waste it selfishly." The conversation was honest, but not cruel. Over the years, my parents had come to understand that their loss of the inheritance was a natural consequence of their own choices, rather than an unfair punishment imposed by a vindictive grandmother. Michelle had also matured significantly since the college fund crisis. Her interior design business was thriving. She was financially independent for the first time in her adult life, and she was raising her children with an understanding of the value of education and hard work, rather than entitlement and dependence. "Emma," she said as we walked through the conference center, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for what happened with Grandma's will. If she had left the money to Mom and Dad, they would have just continued enabling my irresponsibility. Losing that inheritance forced all of us to grow up and learn to take care of ourselves. Have you ever realized that what seemed like a crisis at the time was actually the best thing that could have happened to your family?" That's exactly how I felt reflecting on the college fund theft and its consequences. My parents' betrayal had led to my grandmother's intervention, which had secured not just my financial future but also forced positive changes in everyone's behavior and attitudes. The Biomedical Research Institute I had established with my inheritance was now employing dozens of scientists and engineers working on projects that would help millions of patients worldwide. We were developing technologies for spinal cord injury recovery, advanced prosthetics, and treatments for neurodegenerative diseases. Every dollar of my grandmother's money was being used to advance medical science and improve human lives. But perhaps more importantly, the Margaret Thompson Memorial Scholarship Program had provided full college funding for over 200 young women studying STEM fields. Many of these students came from families that couldn't afford higher education, and they were now becoming doctors, engineers, and researchers who would continue the cycle of using education to benefit society. "Your grandmother would be so proud," my mother said, as we toured the research institute that bore her name. She always believed that education was the best investment anyone could make, and look at everything you've accomplished with the opportunities she provided. The research institute also served as a daily reminder of the importance of making principled decisions, even when they create family conflict. My grandmother could have quietly replaced my stolen college fund without changing her will, maintaining family harmony while enabling continued irresponsibility. Instead, she chose to send a clear message about values and consequences, creating temporary pain that led to permanent positive change. During our visit, I showed my family the wall of photos featuring scholarship recipients and research achievements that had been made possible by my grandmother's wealth. Each picture represented someone whose life had been improved because my grandmother chose to invest in education and medical research rather than fund my parents' retirement and Michelle's lifestyle. "This is what $4 million looks like when it's invested wisely," I said, gesturing toward the photos of successful students and revolutionary medical devices. "Compare this to what it would have looked like if it had been spent on vacations, luxury purchases, and early retirement." The contrast was stark and undeniable. My grandmother's money had funded life-changing research, educational opportunities, and medical breakthroughs rather than being gradually consumed through irresponsible spending and family favoritism. But the most meaningful aspect of our family's transformation was that it had been built on genuine change rather than forced compliance. My parents weren't behaving responsibly because they were being monitored. They were doing so because they had finally learned the lessons that should have guided their behavior all along. "We understand now that love isn't about giving people everything they want," my father said during our family dinner. "Real love is about helping people become the best versions of themselves, even when that requires saying no to their immediate desires." The wisdom in his statement showed how much he had grown since the inheritance crisis. He was no longer the man who thought that stealing from one daughter to fund another daughter's vacation was acceptable family financial management. As we concluded our visit, Michelle pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Emma," she said, "I want you to know that I've told my children the truth about what happened with your college fund and Grandma's inheritance. I want them to understand that actions have consequences and that education should always be a priority." Her decision to be honest with her children about our family's history was encouraging, because it suggested that the lessons from our experience would be passed down to the next generation, rather than being forgotten or minimized over time. The evening ended with my parents presenting me with a scrapbook they had created, documenting my academic and professional achievements from childhood through my current research success. It was the kind of recognition and celebration that I had never received growing up, but it was meaningful now because it was based on genuine understanding and appreciation, rather than obligation or guilt. "This is the daughter we should have been celebrating all along," my mother said, as we looked through photos of science fairs, graduation ceremonies, and research presentations. "We're sorry it took us so long to understand how special you are and how important your work is." As I flew back to Boston the next day, I reflected on the journey that had brought our family from dysfunction to genuine mutual respect and support. The college fund theft that had seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately led to outcomes that were better for everyone involved than what would have happened if my parents had continued their patterns of favoritism and irresponsibility. My grandmother's decision to restructure her inheritance based on character rather than family obligations had created a legacy that would benefit thousands of people through medical research and educational opportunities. More importantly, it had forced our family to confront destructive patterns and develop healthier relationships based on earned respect rather than manipulated guilt. The woman who had nearly dropped out of college because her parents stole her education fund was now a leading researcher whose work was improving lives around the world. The parents who had lost millions of dollars because of their greed and favoritism had learned to live within their means and treat their daughters equally. The sister who had been spoiled and entitled had become financially independent and responsible. Sometimes the most loving thing families can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when the immediate consequences are painful and controversial. My grandmother's courage in changing her will had saved not just my educational future, but our entire family's trajectory toward responsibility and mutual respect. If you're reading this, and you're facing family members who prioritize short-term gratification over long-term responsibilities, please know that there are people who will support your educational and professional goals, even when your immediate family doesn't understand their value. Sometimes the family members who truly love you are the ones willing to make difficult decisions to protect your future. Education is the one investment that no one can ever take away from you. And it's worth fighting for even when the people who should support you choose other priorities instead. The skills, knowledge, and opportunities that come from education will serve you throughout your life, long after the people who doubted you have realized their mistakes. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had family members undervalue your educational goals? How did you handle situations where immediate family members didn't support your dreams? Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar challenges. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that your education and future are worth protecting, even when it requires making difficult family decisions. See you in our next story here on Sweet Revenge Diaries.